Okay, well, why don't we get started? Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's lecture, which is part of the regular Krika lecture series. My name is Ted Gerber. I'm the faculty director of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia, also known as Krika. And as I mentioned, this is part of our regular Thursday afternoon lecture series. So before I turn the floor over to my colleague to introduce today's speaker, I just want to make a brief program note. We will not be holding a lecture next week in honor of the very brief UW spring break, which consists of canceling class Friday next week. So we won't have a lecture next Thursday evening. Then we will resume on April 8th at 4 p.m., same time, same place. And the speaker then will be Sean Roberts of George Washington University. And his topic will be China and the Uyghurs, cultural genocide in the name of counterterrorism. So just one final logistical note, please do mute your mics during the lecture. And also we ask that you refrain from using the chat because we feel that it generally distracts people from the lecture itself. So when it becomes time to open the floor for questions, we'll ask you to use the raise hand function in the participants area. Unless for some reason that doesn't work, in which case then you can put your question in the chat. But please generally refrain from the chat and make sure your mics are off during the lecture so we don't pick up inadvertent sounds. So now I'll turn the floor over to my colleague, Catherine Ciancia, who's Associate Professor of History here at UW-Madison, and she will introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Anita Kurimay. Professor Kurimay is an associate professor at Bryn Mawr College, and she's been teaching there since 2013, the year after she received her PhD from Rutgers University. She has a wide range of research interests. They include the history of sexuality, women and gender history, conservatism and the politics of the far right, the history of human rights, and the history of sport. And she's published articles on Hungarian gay and lesbian history in journals such as Sexualities and East European Politics and Societies. And she's also received a range of fellowships and awards, including a Mellon Foundation, Penn Humanities Forum Regional Fellowship, and a Max Weber Postdoctoral Fellowship at the European University Institute. Professor Kurimay's first book, which came out with Chicago University Press last year, is titled Queer Budapest, 1873 to 1961. And it's no exaggeration to say that Queer Budapest, which examines the politics of non-normative sexualities in modern Budapest, is a revolutionary book in the field of East European history. While historians have certainly looked at the formation of gender identity in East European, in modern Eastern Europe, there have been few, if any, studies of non-normative sexualities. Professor Kurimay's book reveals these histories across an impressively expansive time period, from the Habsburg Empire to the illiberal Haughty regime in the interwar period, to the fascist period during the Second World War, and then into the post-war communist years. She shows us the changes and, in some ways more surprisingly, the continuities across this vast panorama of modern Hungarian history. And just as importantly, she provides us with a model of how a historian might actually do this kind of work, considering that the sources, the historical record, has often erased the experiences of gay and lesbian historical actors. She also helps us to reevaluate our understanding of the perceptions of post-1989 LGBTQ politics in Hungary and Eastern Europe more broadly. And in her epilogue, she notes, for instance, that multiple constituencies on both the right and the left have been too eager to connect the contemporary LGBTQ movement in Hungary with the West and with ideas about democracy, an approach that neglects the complicated relationship between Hungarian history, and particularly illiberal regimes in Hungarian history, and non-normative sexualities. I'm really looking forward to her talk, not least because of the preview that I got this morning when she very kindly came in to talk to the undergrads in my Modern Eastern Europe class. She answered their questions, actively engaging them very graciously. They had so many questions about her work, and I was just so impressed with how she engaged with the students. So the title of her talk for us today is Queer Budapest, Sex, Society, and the Illiberal State, Past and Present. I know that you all join me in warmly welcoming Professor Anita Kurimay.
Thank you so much for that really generous introduction. And also thank you for the opportunity for me able to talk about my book, to this distinguished audience. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and begin. So the end of the 19th century saw Budapest arrival to the scene of modern metropolises. It was created in 1873, and it became the centerpiece of the Hungarian state to become modern. And queers were at the heart of this project, both at the same time being a representative of degeneration, but also in the eyes of officials and statesmen in the Hungarian capital, to the promise to what it meant to be modern. Homosexual and homosexuality, the word itself was invented by a Hungarian. Homosexuals became embraced as a sign of modernity and a promise. And as I argue in my book, this led to the creation of one of the first homosexual registries in the Western world, not necessarily as a form of punishment, but rather as tracking of blackmailers, and also as a way of protecting what I call respected homosexuals who otherwise were full members of Hungarian society from blackmailers. So Budapest in the late 19th century emerged quite vigorously to the scene. And we see the visuals, and here is just a few visual images of Budapest at the time. It reminded contemporaries of Paris, and soon enough, but the late 19th century, early 20th century, contemporaries started to refer to Budapest as the Paris of Eastern Europe. However, what I like to argue, and I would argue and put forward in the book, that the early 20th century, Budapest was actually ahead of Paris, London, even Berlin, when it came to its management, the management of sexuality, and in particular non-normative sexuality, both in terms of imagining and seeing a public and a vibrant sexual culture as, again, a sign of modernity and progress, but also, again, very importantly, the protection of, again, what I call respectful homosexuals, which were otherwise dutiful and productive members of Hungarian society. And again, this is just give you a quote that Budapest received international acclaim for its speedy growth and also modernity. Again, just to give you another example, it wasn't just the homosexual registry that was new and novel and inventive, but also Budapest became home of the first continental subway, which, if you've been to Budapest, you see that it's still running, albeit creakily. So the city officials, journalists, and policemen traveled across the globe and truly looked at ways in which essentially urban planning and the city management could be the most scientific and forward-looking. And this is the result, and this was the result, and this is how, for instance, in my case, the homosexual registry came about. And again, and it's important that with the registry, which then continues in the subsequent political regimes that were very different in character, and I'll get to it in a moment. But this approach, I argue, was written out of history and really occluded from history on both sides of the Iron Curtain, very much for the reason of the Cold War, and we will get to that. But just to give you an example of, in terms of the detailed information that the homosexual registry contained, which was again set up in the early 20th century, and for all historical purposes, it's likely continued until 1989, and we can talk more about it in the Q&A in terms of its whereabouts. It continues to be missing, but information from the registry could be located across time, and this is how the registry in the early 20th century recorded information. So you could see it's incredibly extensive and truly wants to get a comprehensive look of the people who are registered. And I have to, I should mention that this was only for homosexual men, since it was only male homosexual acts that were criminalized, unlike in, say, the Austrian part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, where both male and female homosexuality was criminalized in the late 19th century. And so this registry continues in the following era after the fall of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, after World War I, where essentially we'll have a subsequent illiberal regimes that I argue, for very different reasons, but continue to actually tolerate and also protect this class of homosexual men, despite keeping the registry ongoing. So traditional historiography that looks at the legacy of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, in this case of Hungary especially, tend to stress the restructures, the very vast differences in terms of political system that follow after World War I, when Hungary experiences a communist regime and then an authoritarian conservative regime, followed by, of course, communism. So these historians tend to stress the differences and the political ruptures. However, what I argue and what I showcase in my book Queer Budapest is that if we look at actually these regimes through the lens of sexuality, a remarkable picture emerges, namely that these regimes actually learned and built on one another and continued a very similar approaches in their treatment of non-normative sexualities. So I essentially put forth 4 kind of main arguments throughout my book, which covers the history of non-normative sexualities from the late 19th century really up to the present. One is about continuity, that is how subsequent political regimes that were often ideologically opposed learned on and built on one another's approaches. I also complicate this idea that, you know, information and the circulation of knowledge was always west to east. I show that in particular the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Budapest was often at the forefront in discussions and both practice in terms of the treatment of non-normative sexualities and in particular homosexuality. And then I also complicate this notion that conservative governments and conservative political systems are inherently opposed to homosexuality. And I argue that actually the conservative interwar regime continued to tolerate certain forms of homosexuality in private, while of course at the same time being incredibly conservative in other ways. And finally, the last point I want to make, and I'm making the book and I want to make today, is really the relationship between archives and collective memory. And I argue that because of the historical silencing that were essentially inherited by each regimes, and they continued for different reasons, but the continuing historical silencing of queer sexualities and its records truly have a fundamental influence on the ways in which we have to understand the gender and sexual politics since 1989 and today. But just to keep going on, I'll maybe talk briefly about just two of these illiberal systems in more detail, and just mentioned the state socialist era briefly. So 1919, following World War I, Hungary becomes the second Soviet nation, second Soviet state after, of course, Russia, where communists come into power. Now, this history, a very brief one, but mind you, 133 days, has been characterized by historians as an utter failure, both in terms of its the regime's brutality domestically, but also a total failed foreign policy in terms of contributing to Hungary's great territorial loss following World War I. And I don't necessarily dispute any of this, but what I like to show and talk a little bit about is how, if you look at these regimes through the lens of sexuality, and in particularly its approach to non-normative sexuality, in fact, a remarkable picture emerges. That is that the Hungarian communists were actually at the forefront in rethinking the ways in which homosexuality has been approached. So on this picture, you see Sigmund Freud on the right and Sándor Ferenczi on the left, who of course were the forefathers of psychoanalysis. And in terms of thinking about sexuality and homosexuality in particular, the dominant medical approaches were psychiatry and neurology, the two dominant professions who were tasked to deal with homosexuality, and they did so by pathologizing it as a medical or a mental illness, and that approach was, of course, institutionalized across the monarchy and across Europe, thinking about, of course, the biological nature of homosexuality. Psychoanalysis, on the other hand, really stressed the psychological and unconscious and childhood, the importance of childhood in shaping sexual preferences and sexual desire. And so what I happened to find miraculously, and again, this is a whole nother story in itself, into the archives of the city archives in Budapest, was the remarkable documents of the communist justice system of this brief communist dictatorship of the experimental criminology department, which was set up by the communists very immediately after they come into power. And here we could see that instead of thinking about homosexuality as a pathological criminal behavior, they elevate psychoanalysis and psychological approaches, that is environmental factors as opposed to biological innate factors, as the prime determining reason for one's homosexuality. And so instead of Vienna, instead of London or Berlin, psychoanalysis actually becomes institutionalized first at a university, not on these the places where we associate psychoanalysis with, most namely Vienna or even London or Berlin, but rather in Budapest. So during the brief period of the communist dictatorship, psychoanalysis and more generally the social sciences are elevated as the way forward, as a way to revolutionize society and transform Hungarian subjects into communist citizens. And it is incredibly, this is very much influences and manifests itself the ways in which they approach homosexuality at the experimental criminology department. And so I found records where you can see that instead of the same people who would have under the former system would have been thought as medically ill, also having a criminal behavior, are reconceptualized as as people whose homosexual acts are a result of their underprivileged and disadvantaged background due to, of course, the bourgeois and capitalist society, right? So you see a reframing of homosexuality as essentially a behavior that at the same time is a result of unfortunate circumstances, psychological and sociological, but also a circumstance that could be reformed and healed through the means of talk therapy that is, you know, psychological and psychoanalytical modes that could be or treatments could actually be put forth to heal and reintegrate former homosexuals into the Hungarian future socialist society. And now, of course, we have to realize that 133 days was very short, and so most likely these efforts were never actually fully carried out. Nevertheless, I argue that the idea that sexuality was fluid and that certain homosexualities could be healed remain influential in the coming decades. And so this is just to show that Budapest and the Hungarian communists were not only revolutionary in terms of the reconceptualization of homosexuality, which foreshadowed approaches, interwar approaches, both in communist Russia, but also in Vienna and Weimar Berlin, that again thought about homosexuality through much more in a psychoanalytical and lens. But also, I argue that was actually a revolutionary approach to crime, that where essentially crime and criminality is reimagined through the lens of psychoanalysis and so the social sciences more generally. But so what happens when, of course, the communists are defeated and we arrive to the interwar authoritarian conservative regime that defines itself totally against as an anti-communist, anti-liberal, nationalist, conservative system that, of course, in contrast to interwar Czechoslovakia or Germany, doesn't allow really a democratic debate, but rather is united by a conservative and nationalist revisionist ideology. And so, again, I think we have to take into consideration that this is an incredibly politically conservative regime that also had very conservative ideas about gender norms and prescribed military masculinity, and also for its women, the idea of stay at home and fulfilling the nation meant to be a good mom, and similarly to interwar regimes more generally, very much invested in the birth of healthy future Hungarian babies. But nevertheless, again, if we look at the actual records, what becomes visible that the same conservative regime that really came to police heterosexuality itself and women primarily really went after prostitution, venereal disease, nevertheless continued to tolerate certain forms of homosexuality. And again, we have to see this in the context of post-World War I, where officials on the ground were very much aware that after 5 years of trench war and being away in all male environments, many men, and half of Hungarian men were perished by 2 million men, but 2 million men came back after the war. Many men were exposed to homosexual behaviors. Many men actually participated. And also, just like many other urban cities across Europe, there was a visible homosexual or queer male scene in Budapest following the war. And so the idea is of sexuality being fluid, that is the fact that your environment can corrupt, was an idea that the conservative officials and people on the ground also adhere to, just like their communist counterparts, which was one of the reason why the conservatives, the conservative leadership, as well as the police and the city leadership of Budapest, decided to really limit discourses and public discourses about homosexuality. They believed that they could not talk about homosexuality for the fear of people being allured to such a behavior. On the other hand, the idea that that sexuality was fluid and things could be also healed was also important, in the sense that officials on the ground, just as this public health official in the 1930s that you can see, were acutely aware that a lot of people were exposed and had homosexual encounters, but that didn't mean that they were not productive members and they could not be full members of society. So they actually hoped to rehabilitate Hungarian men and aspire them to all those conservative gender norms that aspired, and they were very visible and in terms of ideas were disseminated ad nauseum. But nevertheless, on the ground, homosexuals, I've argued, could continue to continue their homosexual lifestyle as long, and this is very important, they did so in private, away from public eye, and also they engaged in consensual sexual acts. And just to show you something, and this is very important in the context of course, now we are in the mid-1930s, at the same time when Nazi Germany and fascist Italy already prosecuting their homosexuals, and as not fulfilling the ideas, of course, a new Nazi or new fascist men, the Hungarian authorities decided not to do that. Yet the registry, which I introduced you to at the beginning, continue to be in place. And so this is the same author whose quote we saw before, in a different publication, publishes an article where he actually details the different types of personnel on the male homosexual registry, which by the 1930s, you could see ranged to about 3,500 individuals. And what you can see is that you could see all school of life, different professions, different socioeconomical backgrounds. But it's important that from this large registry, barely any of these people were actually prosecuted and brought to trial. So the registry continued to function, and they, in fact, under the conservative regime, male sex work was increasingly scrutinized and prosecuted, along with underage sex, but also people who were on the registry but were blackmailed also could be protected by the police actually going after the blackmailers, as opposed to the, so to speak, respectable homosexuals themselves. And this tolerant attitude, I argue, comes to an end with Hungary's entry to World War I, where I found documents that in 1941, the Ministry of Interior actually wanted to set up a homosexual battalion, not unlike the Jewish labor force, based on the registry, which then the Ministry of War said, thank you, but no thank you. But then really the real break comes with the brief Szálasi regime, which is a very, of course, at the end of World War II, pro-Nazi regime that breaks this long history of tolerance and actually creates a new legal code that would have actually not only punished homosexual acts, but would lead to castration of homosexuals. However, with the end of the war, this never actually were implemented, and we arrived to the communist regime, which actually continues on one hand the silencing of homosexuality. So in official discourse, there's almost no mention of homosexuality. At the same time, it also steps up the criminal prosecution of homosexuals. But what I wanted to just mention before I show you a turn to lesbians and the history of female homosexuals is that another striking feature of this toleration and silencing that the conservative interwar regime had, that not even the far-right elements, so not even the pro-Nazis and fascist Hungarians bring up homosexuals as scapegoats, which something that would happen elsewhere. Again, there's the silencing cut across political affiliation that not only conservatives, but also the far-right and Nazi elements also shared in the interwar years. So then finally, when homosexuality bursts into the scene and becomes a national scandal, it does not involve male homosexuality, but rather lesbianism. And so lesbianism could not go on trial because it was not decriminalized. Nevertheless, in the form of adultery, female homosexuality becomes and serves as basically the impetus for one of the greatest political scandals of the 1920s. So the scandal involves the founder of the conservative Hungarian Women's Association, Cecile Tormai, who you could see is one of the people who welcomes Admiral Horthy on the right, who becomes the leader of the conservative Hungarian regime in the interwar era. That Tormai is, as the founder of the conservative women's organization, is also the editor of the most important conservative journal in Hungary, and she truly identifies the kind of interwar conservative norms in terms of her political belief: anti-Semitic, nationalistic, and also adheres and disseminates conservative gender norms, even though she fails to live up to her own her prescriptions. The other, and this is just another picture of her, and the other party in the scandal is the co-founder of the Hungarian conservative women's movement, Eduardina Pallavicini on the left, and her noble husband, Rafael Zichy, who actually initiates the scandal by filing for divorce based on adultery between the two women. And so the two, and then subsequently the women sue him for libel, and the two cases go on for 5 years. The scandal really is reported widely in not only in the papers of Budapest, but across Hungary. And really the trials, both trials, are all about what the two women did in the bedroom. The servant voices who are become the bearers of truth initially. They are the ones who are the kind of key witnesses. Rafael Zichy have his servants using cutting edge technology, installing microphones in the women's bedroom along with peepholes, and they record their observations, and this is where the bulk of the accusations come. In addition, though, there were the trials have over 100 witnesses from the cream of the crop of aristocracy, as well as medical experts who testify on, what lesbianism meant and what female homosexuality consisted according to medical opinions of the time. And what is important is that this was all, again, the whole trial was about the sexual nature of their relationship. Yet when we come to the end of the trial, and there are indications that actually Horthy, so the regent themselves, actually personally made sure that there were the right decisions, and it's important to say what those decisions were. So the Zichy basically lost on all accounts. He couldn't divorce his wife, and also he was, and the servants were found guilty of libel and eventually put in jail. But what is important that the courts, the end of the 5-year hiatus and trial after trial, the courts eventually decided to write sexuality out of the case, right? And they reframed the relationship of the two women as essentially asexual friendship. And again, it's just to give you a flavor. This is a quote that comes from the criminal court's decision. And so in doing so, of course, they would allow for Tormai to go on and reclaim her public life, which then also would include being nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1937, but also importantly, make sure that female homosexuality essentially would be written out of historical records. And why this is incredibly important is because something happens to the records, and Austro-Hungarian legacy bureaucracy usually leaves a lot of records. Yet the only thing that survives from this mammoth case, and the two cases, is literally the final decisions of the courts and the servant voices. All the other sources, likely the ones, particularly the medical ones that could have implicated the two women, all the aristocrat voices and all the people who were deposed, all those sources are basically gone from the historical files. And I think this is, again, becomes very important in light of what happens next, which is the communist system that, of course, the state socialist political system that follows after World War II and a brief democratic experiment. But by 1949, of course, Hungary, along with the rest of the Eastern Bloc, becomes basically a satellite state of the Soviet Union. And so why this is important, because the same silencing that continues under the communist system, albeit for different reasons, and I'll talk about that in a moment, allows Tormai to reemerge after 1989 as a usable and beloved figure of the far right, as the greatest Hungarian woman ever lived. The fact that these sources disappeared also allow the new nationalist groups to embrace her for her conservative, and of course it's not surprising that they embrace her for her views, which again were anti-Semitic, chauvinistic, and espousing traditional gender norms. But what is more surprising, that they do so without examining her personal persona, which fell short both the conservative interwar era, but also current expectations of great Hungarians. And so what the state socialist era has to do with this silencing is threefold. It's important because the silencing continues on the name of in many ways from the fear and driven by the fear of the idea that homosexuality is something that is environmental, that it could actually, once exposed, once talked about, you could become curious, and you could generate more interest. So the silencing in public discourse around homosexuality really continues until the 1980s of the HIV/AIDS crisis that then breaks this official silencing. But that is also important, just returning to the registry, that in fact the homosexual registry continues under the communists. And I found records, again, the registry continues to missing. We can talk about it and discuss it maybe in the Q&A, what reasons, why that would be. But I found concrete evidence in the archives of the Secret Service, the relevant of the KGB, that the homosexual registry continued to be used, be used as a form of, as a way to turn people into informants in the price of keeping their homosexuality secret. So in many ways, this also reinforces the kind of silencing that implicates both the communist regime and people who worked for it, but also the homosexuals themselves who became informants under this blackmail. And then importantly, the final piece of this, of course, that, paradoxically, and again, we can talk more about it in the Q&A, Hungary, along with the Czechoslovakia, actually turns out it becomes one of the first countries that decriminalizes male homosexual acts under the age of 20 in 1961, going into effect to 1962, which is way before the US, even West Germany and the UK do so. But they do so with really the elevation of the long gone medical perception of medical pathologization of homosexuality. So instead of seeing homosexuality as simply as a environmental or a situational and a criminal behavior, they decriminalize male homosexual acts as a form of medical pathology. And this comes after the brief period of the 50s of the high Stalinist era, when really, following kind of the 1919 example, the communists really tried to reform homosexuals and turn them into heterosexuals. As the failures became apparent that you can't just cure homosexuals and turn them into heterosexuals, the state decriminalizes male homosexual acts and homosexuality, but at the same time, also by pathologizing it as essentially an innate medical pathology, also plants the seed of a deep-seated homophobia that continued to exist post '89, that sees homosexuality as a medical pathology. And so now, just to return to past and present in this idea of the long line of silencing allowed Tormay, the far right and nationalists after '89, but particularly really in the 2000s, re-embrace historical figures of the past, such as Tormay, regardless of their private persona. And very much, we have a situation today when Fidesz, of course, the far right leading party, and with Viktor Orban, the prime minister, is absolutely aware that there are so many homosexuals among its ranks. But at the same time, and often, in fact, as this gentleman on the picture demonstrates, often the very same people who've been proposing really the anti-LGBTQ regulations that are being exaggerated and really become much more explicit during COVID, whether it's the banning of trans and gender transformation, or even gender nonconformity, the banning of gay adoption, etc. Often the same people are known homosexuals and known queers themselves. Yet, very similarly, like very similarly as it happened in the interwar conservative era in the case of Cecile Tormay. As long as these people who disseminate these nationalist ideas keep their own sexuality private, Fidesz and in general the far right do not care about what they do in their private life unless their queerness really bursts into the scene, which was what happened with this gentleman who was a founder of Fidesz. Sire was a founder of Fidesz, the political party who now is, of course, has been in the supermajority in Hungary since 2008, and who has been actually in the European Parliament since, I believe 2004. So he's been known to be gay, but no one, and yet at the same time also, again, passed, a constitutional ban on gay marriage, etc. Yet in the past November, he was busted for being at the secret homosexual gathering in Brussels. And he was busted by the Brussels police for breaking COVID regulations. And he was actually caught climbing down the gutter with a backpack full of ecstasy. So initially the Hungarian media totally ignored it. And of course, it received a lot of attention. It played wonderfully to the international media in terms of underscoring the hypocrisy of what's happening with the, Polish and Hungarian leading parties' approach to homosexuality. And you could see even receive some corporate interest by Lego, a pretty ingenious sire is the one with the little yellow guy climbing down. But what is instructive is to look at what happens in the mainstream Hungarian media, which is of course mostly owned by Fidesz oligarchs, or by now he's essentially written out of history. He's not talked about, and as if he's never existed. And this brings me to the last point. What I want to make is the kind of tragic legacy of this silencing and erasure that also affects the queer and LGBTQ community itself. So while this idea that queerness and gays came on the wings of liberal democracy, of course, has served Fidesz and nationalists across the Eastern Bloc to say that it's a democratic West and it's Western influence, and it's the EU who's pushing these non-Hungarian, non-Polish identities into the public sphere. If you look at the history, of course, it's not true. But ironically, what is also interesting is that not having historical traces and not having these histories also basically not allowed the queer communities in Hungary and elsewhere to have a usable past, right? So you can have really historically problematic figures, so to speak, like Cecile Tormay and Radcliffe Hall in the British context. But what is different, like the likes of Oscar Wilde and Radcliffe Hall, with all their problems in terms of class and their own prejudices, nevertheless served as soundboards and platforms for the LGBTQ community to have these very important discussions about the legacy of these figures, but also thinking about constructing a usable LGBTQ past for their respected places. In Hungary, this has not been the case. For one reason, of course, Cecile Tormay's political views were very, it just did not serve the interests of the LGBTQ community. But also, importantly, I argue that the historical and systematic silences of the LGBTQ voices and presence in their long history also stopped them from allowing the now visible and growing LGBT communities to claim them for their own selves and have their own histories, not just focusing in the present. Anyway, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.